It began, as so many strange discoveries do, with a simple house clearance. Eleanor Voss had spent 3 weekends emptying her late aunt's home in Savannah, Georgia, a narrow, ivy-choked townhouse that had belonged to the Pruitt family for 5 generations. Most of what she found was unremarkable: chipped china, moth-eaten quilts, a stack of unpaid utility bills from decades past. But in the basement, behind a collapsed shelf of canning jars, she found a cedar chest that no one in the family could remember ever seeing opened. The lock had rusted shut, so Eleanor pried it with a flathead screwdriver, half expecting nothing but mildew. Instead, she found a folded Confederate-issue blanket, a bundle of letters tied with twine, a soldier's brass compass, and, wedged beneath a false bottom she almost missed, a tin photograph case with a cracked hinge. Inside the case sat a single photograph, protected by a sheet of oiled paper that had somehow kept the image from crumbling to dust. When Eleanor peeled back the paper, her hands went cold. The photograph showed a group of Union officers standing before a row of tents, and at the center of the group stood a man she recognized instantly from every history textbook she had ever owned: General William Tecumseh Sherman. But it wasn't Sherman that made her pulse quicken. It was the color. The photograph was not black and white. It was not sepia-toned, nor hand-painted with the crude brushstrokes common to colorized daguerreotypes of the era. The blues of the Union coats were rich and saturated, the greens of the Georgia pines behind the tents were layered with shadow and highlight, and the skin tones of every man in the frame looked disturbingly, impossibly alive, as though the photograph had been taken yesterday and dressed up to look old. Eleanor did not know much about photographic history, but she knew enough to understand that in 1864, during Sherman's march to the sea, color photography simply did not exist. Eleanor's older brother worked in archival preservation at a university library, and it was through him that she was introduced to Dr. Absalom Reyes, a specialist in 19th-century photographic processes who had spent his career cataloging Civil War-era images for the Library of Congress. When she showed him the photograph, sliding it across his cluttered desk, Reyes went silent for nearly a full minute. He turned the photograph over in his gloved hands, tilting it toward the light, running a magnifying loop along the emulsion. Finally, he set it down and looked at Eleanor with an expression she would later describe as somewhere between fascination and dread. "Where did this come from?" he asked, not as a question but as a demand. She told him everything: the chest, the false bottom, the oiled paper. Reyes listened without interrupting, then picked the photograph back up and held it beneath a desk lamp. "This is printed on albumen paper," he said slowly. "The kind that was standard for wet plate photography through the entire war. The paper is period correct. The silvering pattern, the emulsion cracking, the fiber content, all of it says 1864. He paused. "But the color shouldn't be here. Color like this wasn't even theorized until the 1890s, and it wasn't commercially viable until the 1930s. Whoever made this either invented a photographic process 50 years ahead of its time and never told a soul, or—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Within a week, Reyes had arranged for the photograph to be examined by a small team at a private conservation lab affiliated with his university: a forensic photo analyst named Priya Chandrasekhar and a materials chemist named Owen Falk, both of whom had spent careers debunking forged historical documents. Eleanor sat in on the first session, watching as the two of them ran the photograph through a hyperspectral imaging scanner designed to detect pigment composition at a molecular level. What they found unsettled even the skeptics in the room. "The color isn't sitting on top of the image," Chandrasekhar said, staring at her monitor. "It's not tinted. It's not painted. It's embedded directly into the emulsion layer, the same layer that captured the light in the first place. Whatever process made this, the color and the exposure happened at the same time, in the same chemical bath." Falk ran a second test, extracting a microscopic sample from the photograph's edge for spectroscopy. "Beeswax, gelatin, silver halide, all expected for the period," he reported. "But there's something else mixed in. Cochineal extract. Indigo. A compound I can't fully identify, possibly derived from iron gall ink chemistry. It's crude. It's improvised. But it works, and it shouldn't." Eleanor asked the question everyone in the room was avoiding. "So is it fake?" Reyes shook his head slowly. "If it were a forgery, it would be the single most sophisticated forgery in the history of photographic fraud, executed by someone who somehow had access to a chemical process no one else on Earth understood, and then chose to bury it in a basement in Savannah instead of selling it for a fortune. No, I don't think it's fake. I think it's real, and I think that's far more frightening. It was Eleanor, not the scientists, who first noticed the figure standing at the edge of the frame. She was almost invisible at first glance, positioned just behind Sherman's left shoulder, half obscured by the shadow of a tent pole, wearing a plain gray dress with a white collar, the kind worn by camp nurses, missionaries, or chaplains' aides. Her face was turned slightly away from the camera, but even in profile, her expression was unlike anyone else's in the photograph. The officers around her stood rigid, posed, aware of the camera. She did not. She was watching something, or someone, just outside the frame. Eleanor pulled up digitized rosters of Sherman's staff and support personnel during the March to the Sea, cross-referencing every name of every woman known to have traveled with the Union Army through Georgia in the fall of 1864. Nurses, cooks, laundresses, missionaries attached to the Sanitary Commission. None of them matched. She brought this to Reyes, who dismissed it at first as a likely camp follower whose name simply hadn't survived in the historical record, an unremarkable gap, given how poorly documented civilian women were during the war. But when Chandrasekhar zoomed the scanner in on the woman's collar, something changed the tone of the room entirely. Stitched into the fabric, nearly invisible against the pale gray cotton, was a small embroidered mark, 2 interlocking letters, P and B, framed by a thin diamond border. "That's not decorative," Chandrasekhar said. "That's a unit mark. Or an agency mark." Reyes stared at it for a long moment before speaking. "PB," he said slowly. "There's a name that keeps surfacing in Pinkerton correspondence from that period, always in fragments, never confirmed. The Pinkerton Bureau. Not the National Detective Agency everyone knows, a smaller, quieter offshoot that operated directly under War Department authorization, feeding intelligence to specific generals during sensitive campaigns. Historians have argued for decades about whether it actually existed or whether it was just wartime rumor. Eleanor felt a chill crawl up her spine. "You're saying she was a spy?" "I'm saying," Reyes replied carefully, "that if this mark is what I think it is, she wasn't just present at Sherman's camp. She was placed there. Deliberately. And whoever placed her didn't want it written down anywhere." That night, Eleanor went back through the letters she'd found bundled in the cedar chest, the ones she had set aside as unremarkable family correspondence. Most were routine, updates on crops, complaints about the heat, a cousin's wedding. But one letter, dated 1901 and written in a shaking elderly hand, caught her attention on a second read. It was addressed to "my grandchildren, should they ever wonder," and signed simply, "Your grandmother, once called Prudence." The letter described, in vague and careful language, a woman who had walked among generals and told no one what she carried. It spoke of a season in Georgia, and a duty given by men in Washington who trusted no one else. And near the end, one line stopped Eleanor cold. "If ever a photograph surfaces bearing my likeness beside the general, know that I stood there not by accident, but by design, and that what I witnessed there was never meant for the eyes of history." Eleanor's own great-great-grandmother had been named Prudence Boyle. She had always been a footnote in the family tree, a woman who married late, moved frequently, and left almost no documentation behind. Now, staring at the embroidered initials on the photograph, Eleanor understood why. P.B. Prudence Boyle. She brought the letter to Reyes the next morning, and for the first time since the investigation began, the historian looked genuinely shaken rather than merely intrigued. He read the letter twice, then set it down with the careful reverence of a man handling something far more dangerous than old paper. "If this is authentic," he said, "and if the woman in that photograph really is your ancestor, then we're not looking at a curiosity anymore. We're looking at physical proof of an intelligence operation inside Sherman's command that has never appeared in a single official record. That's not a footnote. That's a rewrite." The second breakthrough came almost by accident. Chandrasekhar, running a final pass of a hyperspectral scanner along the photograph's edges to check for damage, noticed a faint discoloration along the inner seam of Prudence's collar, a place where the thread pattern seemed subtly different from the rest of the stitching, tighter, more deliberate. She adjusted the scanner's wavelength and isolated the seam. What emerged on her monitor made the room go quiet. Hidden within the stitching, sewn in a thread barely a shade darker than the collar itself, was a short sequence of letters and numbers, so small it would have been invisible to the naked eye even under direct examination. SD, hold till December 21st. Reyes stared at the screen for a long moment. December 21st, he murmured. Sherman reached Savannah and offered the city to Lincoln as a Christmas gift on December 22, 1864. Falk, the chemist, looked between the two historians. You're saying she was told to hold something, information, a position, a warning, until one day before Sherman took the city. I'm saying, Reyes replied, that this reads less like a nurse's assignment and more like an operative awaiting confirmation before acting, or before standing down. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. Hold what, though? Hold from doing what? No one in the room had an answer. But Reyes, working late that night through digitized War Department correspondence, found something that gave the question a far darker shape. Buried in a cluster of undated intelligence memos, cross-referenced under a generic administrative heading, was a single fragment that had clearly been misfiled by a records clerk decades earlier, its true significance long forgotten. Confirmed threat against command staff during Georgia campaign. PB to remain embedded. Report only to this office. Not to be logged with field command. There was no signature. Only a small, handwritten notation in the margin, E.S. Edwin Stanton, Reyes said, reading the initials aloud. Lincoln's Secretary of War. If this memo is genuine, it means Stanton personally authorized an undocumented agent to embed herself inside Sherman's staff because of a specific threat against his life, and instructed that her presence never appear in any official channel. The final piece came from Eleanor herself, though she almost missed it. Re-examining the tin photograph case for the third time, she noticed the oiled paper backing was thicker than it should have been, not damaged or warped, but doubled, as though something had been slid between two layers of paper and pressed flat over the decades. Carefully, with Reyes supervising, she peeled the layers apart. Folded inside was a single sheet of War Department stationery, brittle but legible, dated December 1864. Reyes read it aloud, his voice unsteady by the end. Miss Boyle, you have done what few men in uniform could manage. You have watched without being seen, and reported without being heard. The threat we feared did not materialize, though whether from your presence or from luck, I cannot say, and perhaps it is better that no one ever tries to answer that question. You are released from further obligation. Speak of this to no one, not for my sake, but for the safety of those who may one day need women like you again, unnoticed and unclaimed by any roll call. History will not remember you, and that is precisely the point. E.S. The room sat in silence after Reyes finished reading. Eleanor thought of her great-great-grandmother's letter, of the line about walking among generals and telling no one what she carried, and understood now exactly what duty given by men in Washington had meant. Prudence Boyle had not been a footnote. She had been erased, deliberately, by design, at the request of the very man who sent her into that camp, because the government of the United States had, at least once, decided that some protectors of the Republic needed to remain permanently invisible. The deeper the team dug, the more they came to understand that Prudence Boyle's disappearance from the historical record hadn't been an oversight. It had been architecture. Reyes pulled surviving Pinkerton Bureau correspondence from 3 different archives and found the same pattern repeated in fragments. Vague references to field companions, shadow reporters, and unlisted assistants who moved alongside Union commanders during sensitive campaigns, all without formal military status, all absent from muster rolls, all seemingly designed to leave no trace. It makes a kind of grim sense, Reyes explained to Eleanor over coffee one evening, the photograph sitting between them in its protective sleeve. If Stanton was running an informal network of embedded observers, the entire value of that network depended on nobody knowing it existed. The moment one of them appeared in the official record, the whole apparatus would have been compromised. Every operative, past and future, would become a target. Erasure wasn't cruelty. It was operational security. But that raised a harder question, one Eleanor couldn't shake. If secrecy was the entire point, why had Prudence kept the photograph at all? Why hadn't she destroyed it, as her own descendant's letter seemed to suggest she nearly had? The answer came, fittingly, from another letter, this one written by Prudence herself, folded into the same false bottom of the cedar chest, dated decades after the war's end and clearly meant to be found only when the world was ready for it. I kept the photograph not out of vanity, nor defiance, but because someone ought to know, someday, that women stood in places history insists only men occupied. I do not ask to be celebrated. I ask only to be believed. When the time comes, that belief no longer endangers those who come after me. Eleanor Voss did not sell the photograph. Offers came quickly once word began to spread through academic circles. Private collectors, television producers, even a foreign museum interested in Civil War intelligence history, but she declined every one. Instead, working with Reyes and the university's conservation lab, she helped organize a modest public exhibit titled The Woman Who Was Never There, hosted in a small gallery attached to the archive where the photograph now resides on long-term loan. The exhibit does not sensationalize the story. It presents the photograph beside enlarged details of the hidden stitching, the War Department memo, and Stanton's letter, alongside a simple biography reconstructed from fragments, the only biography Prudence Boyle has ever had. At the center of the room hangs a single framed line from her own letter, the one she wrote for grandchildren she knew might never fully understand what she had done. I ask only to be believed. Visitors linger longer than the curators expected. Schoolchildren stop mid-tour. Veterans read the panel twice. Few of them had ever heard the name Prudence Boyle before walking in, and most of them will never see it in a textbook. But for the first time in over a century, a woman who was deliberately written out of history has been quietly, carefully written back in, not as a legend, and not as a hero in the way generals are heroes, but as exactly what she was. Someone who stood where she was told to stand, watched what she was told to watch, and let history forget her because that was the price of doing the job at all. Eleanor still keeps the original cedar chest in her home, empty now except for the folded Confederate blanket and the brass compass. But she keeps a copy of the photograph nearby, in a modest frame on her desk, where she can see it every day, a reminder that the past is rarely as settled as it looks, and that sometimes the most important people in a room are the ones the camera almost missed entirely. What would you have done if you'd found a secret like this buried in your own family's basement? Would you have kept it hidden, the way Prudence once asked, or brought it into the light, the way Eleanor finally did? Let us know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more forgotten stories history tried to leave behind.